I didn't die. This is a picture of my dad's headstone who died 11.5 years ago. As Benjamin Franklin said, there is nothing certain in this world but death and taxes. And until Christ's return, death is a certainty for all of us. Almost every week we have a condolences box in our Sunday bulletin notifying our church family of loved ones who have recently passed away. And in fact, just yesterday we received 2 calls within a couple of hours telling us of family members of our church folks who have passed away. In this week's Sunday school lesson, we're continuing in the unit called Life Like No Other. And this week, as we enter Passion Week, we are looking at a death like no other out of Matthew 27. So if death is universal and it's a certainty, what makes the death of Jesus like no other? Well, your lesson material tells of 3 specific events. One is when he was stripped, he had the crown of thorns placed on his head, he was beaten and mocked. The second event he talks about in the lesson material is when darkness fell upon the land and Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the third event tells of when the Roman centurion looked at Jesus after Jesus had died and said, surely this was the Son of God. Your Sunday school lesson material has a lot of good commentary and background on these passages, so look and glean out some information that you can share with your class concerning those events. But when I think about Christ's death and what makes it unique, I have to go back to the Old Testament. Now, you can do a Google search and find a whole bunch of scriptures pertaining to Old Testament prophecies and Christ's death. And so you might want to do that and share some of those with your class. But for me, the pinnacle of Old Testament foreshadowing and prophecy intersects with Christ's death has to do with the celebration of the Passover feast. I think most of us know that story very well. It started with Moses and him trying to get the children of Israel out of Egypt. There was the sign that you put the blood on the doorposts, and if the angel of death saw the blood, he would pass over and spare that household from the punishment, which was death of the firstborn son. Now, when Moses and the children of Israel actually got out into the desert, God gave them instructions on how to observe and how to remember that Passover event. And you can find that in Deuteronomy chapter 16. In that celebration, there were 3 elements that were the most important, and they were the lamb, the bread, and the wine. When Jesus and the disciples celebrated the Passover, this instituted the Lord's Supper. Jesus took the bread, which was a flat bread with no yeast, and we know from our biblical studies that yeast usually indicated sin. So it took a flat bread with no yeast. It was punctured. It was a scored bread. And Jesus took that bread and said, this is my body. And then he took that wine. There were 4 cups in the Passover celebration, each with a special significance. And he said, this is my blood, which is poured out for you. And then there was the lamb as well. The lamb was a young male, had no imperfections at all. It was a perfect lamb. It was brought into the house for a period of time to inspect, to make sure that it was without blemish. And in doing so, it became very precious to the family. Now, it's interesting as we look at the story of the Lord's Supper that there was no lamb present at that Passover meal. And that's because Jesus himself was that lamb. In fact, 1 Corinthians 5:7 tells us that Jesus is our Passover lamb. So Jesus just didn't celebrate Passover. He personally fulfilled Passover. Now, Romans 1:16 tells us that the gospel is for the Jews first, and then also for the Gentiles. So let's keep this in mind as I explain a little bit more. In our lesson material, we see Jesus quoting from Psalm 22:1, where he shouts out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? I've heard it taught many times, and you probably have too, that at that moment when Jesus was on the cross and he shouted those words, that God actually turned his back on Jesus because God could not stand to look on Christ because he became sin at that point, and God cannot look at sin. Now, while that might preach well, and it might be interesting to hear, I'm not so sure that that's the exact interpretation of what's going on here. So if you will allow me, I'm going to share what I believe is the correct interpretation of this passage. Now, if I were to say to you, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound," you would probably start thinking of that song and maybe even work through some of the lyrics and think about that last verse when we've been there 10,000 years. And so could it be that Jesus was doing the same thing? Because we know that the Psalms are actually songs. And to get people thinking about that psalm, he quoted the very first line of that psalm. Now, we know that this psalm, it's Psalm 22, it's a psalm of David, and it had specific meaning for David in his life. So we can't relate every single event, every single statement in the psalm to Christ. But it's also a psalm that foretells the coming of the Messiah and how he would suffer. So let's look at some of those verses. Psalm 22, starting with the last half of verse 6 and going through verse 8, it says that he was scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. And we remember as Jesus is on the cross how people would say that. He trusts in God, let God save him. Let's look at another verse. Psalm 22, verses 16 through 18 says this: Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them, and they cast lots for my garment. There again, as we know the crucifixion story, we know how people cast lots for Jesus' clothing, how they stared at him. Also, let's look at verse 24. I find this verse very interesting. It says, For he, this is meaning God, has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. I think it's interesting that the psalm says that God did not turn his back, did not hide his face from the afflicted one, which was Christ who suffered for our sins. Now also, the psalm ends on a very high note. And we see that it ends as a psalm of praise. So my interpretation, which may be wrong, I'll just say that up front, this is Jim's interpretation, is that Jesus quoted that first line out of Psalm 22, and it got the people thinking about the psalm. And they could see the similarities between what the psalm foretold and what was happening right then and there. And to the believers, those Jewish believers who were gathered there, even though it seemed like God was turning his back on Jesus, he did not turn his back, did not hide his face from Jesus at that time. And in the end, God's going to get all the praise and the glory. Now also, as I'm disagreeing with things, the point for this lesson out of your material says that Jesus' death is the heart of the gospel. And while I agree with that to a point, I don't think that Jesus' death is the heart of the gospel. It's very key to the gospel. I think the heart of the gospel is next week's lesson, which deals with the resurrection. That's what makes the gospel unique. That is the heart of the gospel. So we know next Sunday is Easter. So teachers, I encourage you to contact your absentees, continue to pray for your class, and that's all I have for this week.